Imagine standing at a crossroads on a moonless night. The air is thick with fog, and the only sound is the distant howling of dogs. 3 paths stretch before you, each disappearing into absolute darkness. You feel the weight of unseen eyes upon you. The temperature drops. Your breath becomes visible in the cold air. And then, from the shadows where the 3 roads meet, you see her. She stands at the center of the intersection, holding 2 flaming torches that cast dancing shadows across her 3 faces. One face looks to the past, one to the present, and one to the future. At her feet, black dogs with glowing eyes circle and whine. The keys hanging from her belt jangle softly, keys to every door between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. This is Hecate, the torchbearer, the key holder, the queen of witches. But here is what they do not tell you in the sanitized retellings. Here is the dark history that has been buried beneath centuries of folklore and modern reinterpretation. Hecate was not always the terrifying goddess of witchcraft and necromancy. She did not begin her existence as a figure of dread, haunting crossroads and commanding the restless dead. No, her transformation from benevolent protector to feared sorceress is a journey that spans thousands of years, crossing cultures and civilizations, reflecting humanity's deepest anxieties about power, the unknown, and the divine feminine. Tonight, we descend into the shadows to uncover the truth. How did a goddess once honored above all others by Zeus himself become a name whispered in fear? How did the protector of households transform into the patron of witches? How did the keeper of the threshold become the guardian of the underworld's darkest corners? This is the dark history of Hecate. And like the goddess herself, this story has 3 faces. The face of her origins, forgotten and ancient. The face of her transformation, dark and troubling. And the face of her legacy, which endures even now in the 21st century. Let us begin our journey at the beginning, before the Olympians, before the classical myths you know, in a time when Hecate was something entirely different. To understand Hecate, we must travel back more than 3,000 years to the western coast of Anatolia, the landmass we now call Turkey. Here, in the region known as Caria, archaeological evidence suggests that Hecate was worshipped long before the Greek pantheon, as we know it took shape. She was not Greek in origin. She was adopted, absorbed into the Greek religious system from the indigenous peoples of Asia Minor. The earliest references to Hecate appear in the region of Caria, particularly around the ancient city of Lagina, where a massive temple complex was dedicated to her worship. This was no minor shrine. The sanctuary at Lagina was one of the most important religious sites in the entire region, suggesting that Hecate held a position of tremendous significance to the Carian people. Annual festivals were held in her honor, and pilgrims traveled from across the region to pay homage to this powerful goddess. But who was she in this earliest incarnation? What aspects did she embody before the Greeks reimagined her? In Anatolia, Hecate appears to have been a mother goddess figure, similar to other ancient Near Eastern deities like Cybele or the Phrygian Magna Mater. She was associated with fertility, with the protection of cities, and most importantly, with the threshold. The threshold, that liminal space between inside and outside, between safety and danger, between the domestic and the wild, was Hecate's domain from the very beginning. Ancient peoples understood that doorways were places of power. They were transition points, vulnerable spaces where malevolent forces might enter. Hecate was the guardian of these spaces. Her image or her symbols would be placed at the entrances to homes, at city gates, and at property boundaries. She was apotropaic, a term meaning that she turned away evil. She protected. She guarded. She was a goddess you wanted on your side. This protective aspect cannot be overstated when we consider Hecate's later evolution. In her earliest form, she was not a figure of fear, but of comfort. Mothers prayed to her for the safety of their children. Families invoked her name to protect their homes. She was, in essence, a domestic goddess, concerned with the everyday welfare of human beings. Archaeological evidence from Caria shows small statues and reliefs of Hecate placed at doorways and gates. These are not images of a terrifying witch goddess. They show a dignified female figure, often holding torches or keys, symbols that would remain associated with her throughout her evolution. The torches illuminated the darkness, driving away both literal and metaphorical threats. The keys represented her control over boundaries, her ability to lock out danger or unlock safe passage. But there is another crucial element to understand about Hecate's Anatolian origins. She was associated with wild places, particularly with caves, mountains, and the spaces beyond civilization. This was not yet the chthonic, underworld association she would later develop, but rather a connection to the untamed natural world. Hecate was a goddess of the wilderness, the places where human order gave way to something older and more primal. The Carian Hecate was also linked to childbirth, another threshold experience, the transition from the womb to the world. Women in labor called upon her for protection during this dangerous passage. The high mortality rates associated with ancient childbirth made this aspect of Hecate's power critically important. She was literally a life or death goddess, but in the most fundamental human sense. Now, as Greek civilization expanded and colonized the western coast of Anatolia, they encountered this powerful local goddess. The Greeks were remarkably adept at religious syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions. They did not seek to destroy the local deities they encountered. Instead, they absorbed them, reinterpreted them, and wove them into their own mythological framework. This is how Hecate entered the Greek pantheon. But she did not enter as a minor figure. Despite being a foreign goddess, despite her origins outside the traditional Olympian hierarchy, Hecate was granted extraordinary honors and privileges by the Greeks. This unusual elevation of a non-Greek deity tells us something crucial, that her worship was too powerful, too deeply rooted in the regions the Greeks now controlled to simply ignore or suppress. The Greek adoption of Hecate represents a fascinating moment in religious history. Here was a goddess who predated Zeus, who came from outside their traditional mythology. Yet she was incorporated with such reverence that she would eventually be described as honored above all others. But this integration would also begin her transformation. As Hecate moved from the Anatolian world into the Greek, her nature began to shift, to darken, to acquire the attributes that would eventually make her the queen of witches. Before we can understand that transformation, we must first examine how the Greeks attempted to explain her presence among their gods. And that explanation centers on one of the most cataclysmic events in Greek mythology: the war between the Titans and the Olympians. The Greeks faced a theological problem with Hecate. She was clearly ancient, clearly powerful, and clearly important to the people they now ruled. But how could they explain her within their mythological framework? How could they account for a goddess who seemed to predate even Zeus, yet who had not been overthrown with the other primordial powers? The solution came in the form of the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympians. This mythological conflict served as a dividing line in Greek religion, separating the old order from the new, the primal chaos from civilized cosmos. According to most accounts, Zeus and his siblings overthrew the Titans, led by Cronos, and established themselves as the new ruling deities. But what about Hecate? The poet Hesiod, writing in approximately the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, provides our most detailed account of Hecate's role in this cosmic upheaval. In his Theogony, a genealogy of the gods, Hesiod describes Hecate as a Titaness, the daughter of the Titans Perseus and Asteria. This lineage is significant. Perseus was associated with destruction, while Asteria was a goddess of the stars and nocturnal prophecy. Already, we see the seeds of Hecate's darker associations: destruction and the night. But here is where the account becomes truly remarkable. According to Hesiod, when Zeus overthrew the Titans, he did not strip Hecate of her powers. Instead, he honored her above all others. Zeus granted her dominion over earth, sea, and sky. He gave her the unique privilege of being the only deity who could grant or withhold blessings in all three realms. This is extraordinary. Not even Zeus himself claimed such universal authority. Hesiod writes that Hecate has a share in the earth, and in the sea, and in the starry heaven. She is honored by the deathless gods. When men on earth offer rich sacrifices and pray according to custom, they call upon Hecate. Great honor comes easily to him whose prayers the goddess receives favorably, and she bestows wealth upon him. For the power surely is with her. Think about what this means. In Hesiod's account, every prayer, every sacrifice, every plea from humanity had to pass through Hecate's judgment. She could choose to grant it or deny it. She was, in effect, the intermediary between mortals and the divine. This made her arguably more important in practical terms, than Zeus himself. What good was the king of the gods if Hecate could simply refuse to deliver your prayers to him? This raises a crucial question. Why would Zeus, who overthrew his own father to claim supreme power, grant such extraordinary authority to a Titaness? Why would he honor a goddess from the old order that he had just defeated? The answer likely lies not in mythology, but in religious reality. Hecate's worship was too widespread, too entrenched, too important to the people to simply discard. The Greeks needed to find a place for her in their pantheon, and they needed to explain her continued power. The solution was to make her unique, to claim that she alone among the Titans had been granted special privileges because she alone had supported Zeus in the war. But this explanation, while solving one problem, created another. By associating Hecate with the Titans, by linking her to the older, more primal order of the cosmos, the Greeks began to push her toward the margins of their religious system. She became liminal, existing between the old and the new, between the civilized Olympians and the chaotic Titans. This liminality would become central to her identity. Hesiod also describes Hecate's influence over various aspects of human life. She could grant victory in battle, success in athletic competitions, good fortune in fishing, prosperity in raising livestock, and protection for children. In other words, she touched every aspect of daily existence. This reflects her Anatolian origins as a comprehensive mother goddess, but now filtered through a Greek lens. However, there is something else in Hesiod's account that deserves attention. He emphasizes repeatedly that Hecate grants these blessings when she chooses to do so. Her favor is not automatic. She must be properly honored, properly approached, properly supplicated. This introduces an element of uncertainty, even danger, into the relationship between Hecate and humanity. A benevolent goddess who always helps is comforting. A powerful goddess who might help if she is pleased, but who might also withhold her aid if she is not properly honored. That is a goddess who inspires fear as much as devotion. And fear, once it enters the relationship between deity and worshipper, has a way of growing. Other early Greek sources support Hesiod's portrait of Hecate as an honored and powerful goddess, but they also begin to add darker elements. By the 6th century before the Common Era, Hecate was being increasingly associated with magic, particularly with harmful magic, with curses and binding spells. The goddess who could grant or withhold blessings could, by extension, be called upon to curse one's enemies. This shift was gradual but inexorable. Hecate was moving from the threshold of the household to the threshold between life and death, between the mortal world and the realm of spirits. Her torches, which once lit the way for safe passage, began to illuminate darker paths. Her keys, which once locked out danger, began to unlock doors that were better left sealed. The question we must ask is why? Why did Greek culture, having adopted this powerful protective goddess, begin to transform her into something more sinister? The answer lies partly in the next aspect of Hecate we must examine: her triple nature and her connection to the crossroads. For it is here, at the intersection of three paths, that Hecate's transformation into the Queen of Witches truly begins. If you were to encounter Hecate in classical Greek or Roman art, you would immediately notice her most striking feature. She is often depicted with three bodies or three heads, facing in different directions. This triple form became so characteristic of Hecate that she was known simply as Trivia in the Roman world, literally meaning of the three ways. But what did this triple nature represent? Why did the Greeks and Romans envision Hecate in this unique, unsettling form? The most common interpretation is that Hecate's three faces represent her ability to see in all directions simultaneously. She sees the past, the present, and the future. Nothing is hidden from her gaze. She perceives what has been, what is, and what will be. This grants her a form of knowledge that even the other gods do not possess. Zeus might rule the cosmos, but Hecate knows its secrets. This omniscient quality made Hecate particularly important for divination and prophecy. Those seeking to know the future, to uncover hidden things, to see beyond the veil of normal perception, called upon Hecate. And in the ancient world, those who sought such knowledge were often called witches. Another interpretation of the triple form relates to the three realms over which Hecate held power. One face looks toward the heavens, one toward the earth, and one toward the underworld. She is the only deity who can move freely between all three realms, who holds dominion in the sky, on land, and in the realm of the dead. This made her a psychopomp, a guide of souls, but also something more dangerous. She could bring things from the underworld into the mortal realm. She could summon the dead. Later traditions, particularly in modern neo-paganism, interpreted Hecate's triple nature as representing the three stages of womanhood: maiden, mother, and crone. This interpretation, while popular today, is not well supported by ancient sources. The Greeks and Romans did not explicitly describe Hecate in these terms. However, the association is not entirely without merit. Hecate was connected to childbirth, representing the mother. She was sometimes depicted as a young woman, the maiden, and increasingly, particularly in her darker manifestations, she was portrayed as an old woman, the crone. These three aspects of feminine power, creation, preservation, and destruction, all resided within her, but Hecate's triple nature found its most powerful expression not in temples or in mythological narratives, but at a very specific location: the crossroads. The crossroads, particularly the three-way intersection, became the sacred space of Hecate. These were the places where her statues were erected, where offerings were left for her, where rituals in her honor were performed. And in the ancient world, crossroads were places of power and danger. Why were crossroads so significant? Because they represented choice, uncertainty, and transition. When you stand at a crossroads, you must decide which path to take. Each choice leads to a different future. The crossroads is a place of potential, but also of anxiety. What if you choose wrong? What if the path you do not take was the better one? This decision, this moment of existential uncertainty, belonged to Hecate. But there is something darker about Crossroads as well. They were places associated with the dead, with ghosts, with malevolent spirits. In many cultures, crossroads were where criminals were executed and buried. They were where suicides, denied burial in consecrated ground, were interred. They were where the boundaries between the living and the dead grew thin. Imagine, if you will, traveling at night in the ancient world. You come to crossroads and must decide which path to take. But the crossroads is where the executed murderer was buried last month. This is where the suicide was interred without proper rites. Their spirits are restless, angry, potentially dangerous. You quicken your pace. You avert your eyes. You pray to Hecate, the goddess of this terrible place, to protect you from the very ghosts and spirits that she herself commands. Do you see what has happened? Hecate has become both the protection against supernatural danger and the source of it. She wards off evil spirits because she controls them. This paradox would become central to her cult. The offerings left for Hecate at Crossroads reflected this dual nature. On the last day of the lunar month, particularly at the new moon when the night was darkest, worshippers would bring offerings to Crossroads and leave them there. These offerings were called Hecate's suppers, or Deipna Hecatea. What did these suppers consist of? Eggs, representing fertility and new life. Honey, a precious substance associated with sweetness and preservation. Cakes, particularly a special kind called amphiphons, round cakes with candles. Garlic, which had apotropaic properties, warding off evil. And fish, particularly red mullet, which was associated with the underworld. But there were darker offerings as well. Black lambs were sacrificed to Hecate at Crossroads, their blood poured into pits dug in the earth. Dogs, the animals most closely associated with Hecate, were also sacrificed, their bodies left at the crossroads as gifts to the goddess. These animal sacrifices, particularly of dogs, tell us something important about how Hecate was perceived. Dog sacrifice was relatively rare in Greek religion and was almost always associated with chthonic, underworld deities. The choice of location for these offerings is also revealing. They were not left at temples or altars within the city. They were left at crossroads, outside the boundaries of civilization, in the liminal spaces between communities. And crucially, once you left an offering for Hecate at a crossroads, you were not supposed to look back. You placed your gift, you spoke your prayer, and you walked away without turning around. To look back was to risk seeing Hecate herself, or worse, to see the ghosts and spirits that attended her. This ritual behavior reveals the fundamental shift in how Hecate was perceived. She was no longer primarily a protective household goddess. She had become something to be feared, something that required propitiation, something you encountered in the dangerous spaces outside the safety of home and city. The crossroads also became associated with magic, particularly with dark magic. If you wanted to curse an enemy, you would go to a crossroads at night, preferably during the new moon, and perform your ritual there, calling upon Hecate to empower your curse. If you wanted to summon the dead to perform necromancy, the crossroads was where you would do it, with Hecate as your intermediary. Greek magical papyri, collections of spells and rituals dating from the 2nd century before the Common Era to the 5th century of the Common Era, are filled with invocations to Hecate. These spells call upon her as night-wandering, tomb-frequenting, lover of darkness, and terrible queen. They ask her to send forth the dead, to torment the living, to bind souls, to inflict nightmares and madness. Here is an example of one such invocation, translated and adapted for modern comprehension. I call upon you, Hecate of the 3 faces, 3 forms, armed with swords, brandishing torches, who wanders at night accompanied by howling dogs and terrible ghosts. I call upon you, who holds the keys to the gates of death. Come to me now, attend my ritual, and send forth your spirits to do my bidding. This is no longer a prayer to a protective mother goddess. This is an invocation of a terrifying supernatural power, a goddess who commands the forces of darkness and death. How did this transformation happen? How did Hecate move from guardian of the household to queen of the witches? The answer lies in several interconnected factors. First, her association with the threshold and with liminal spaces made her a natural goddess for magic, which itself is a liminal practice, operating in the space between the natural and supernatural. Second, her connection to the night and to the moon, which waxes and wanes, representing constant change and transformation, aligned her with the uncertain and the hidden. Third, and perhaps most importantly, her increasing association with the underworld and the dead pushed her further from the realm of the Olympian gods and deeper into the chthonic realm. But there were also specific mythological stories that contributed to Hecate's transformation into the queen of witches. And to understand these stories, we must examine her relationship with 2 of the most famous sorceresses in Greek mythology, Medea and Circe. The transformation of Hecate from a respected goddess to a feared patron of witchcraft cannot be understood without examining the stories of the women who called upon her power. In Greek mythology, the most dangerous and morally complex sorceresses were associated with Hecate. Their actions, their choices, and their fates became intertwined with Hecate's own reputation, darkening her image and cementing her role as the goddess who granted mortals the power to transgress the natural order. Let us begin with Medea, perhaps the most notorious witch in all of classical literature. Medea was a princess of Colchis, a kingdom on the eastern edge of the Black Sea, in what is now the country of Georgia. She was the granddaughter of Helios, the sun god, and the niece of Circe, who we will discuss shortly. But most importantly for our purposes, Medea was a priestess of Hecate. She had been trained in the goddess's dark arts since childhood, when Jason and the Argonauts arrived in Colchis, seeking the golden fleece, Medea's father, King Eads, set impossible tasks for Jason to complete. He had to yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls, plow a field with them, sow the field with dragon's teeth, which would sprout into armed warriors, and then defeat those warriors in battle. No mortal could accomplish these tasks without supernatural aid. Enter Medea. She saw Jason and fell in love with him, a love that some sources say was caused by the goddess Aphrodite, but which Medea herself attributed to Hecate's will. And Medea, priestess of Hecate, had the power to help Jason succeed where any other man would fail. She went to her sacred place, a shrine to Hecate located in a dark grove outside the city. There, at midnight under the new moon, she performed a ritual to invoke the goddess. She sacrificed a black lamb, pouring its blood into a pit while calling upon Hecate by her secret names. And Hecate answered. The ground shook. The trees bent as if in a terrible wind. Dogs howled in the distance. And Hecate appeared, terrible and radiant, attended by howling spirits and phantom hounds. Medea asked for the power to help Jason, and Hecate granted it. She gave Medea a magical ointment that would protect Jason from the fire of the bulls and the weapons of the warriors. She revealed to Medea the secret of how Jason could defeat the dragon that guarded the golden fleece. In return, Medea promised to honor Hecate forever and to spread the worship of the goddess wherever she traveled. With Hecate's help, Jason succeeded. But there was a price. Medea betrayed her father and her homeland. She fled with Jason, and during their escape, she murdered her own brother, dismembering his body and scattering the pieces in the sea to delay her father's pursuit. This is the first horrifying act in a life that would be marked by increasingly terrible crimes. Medea married Jason and bore him children. But Jason, ambitious and unfaithful, eventually decided to abandon Medea and marry the Princess of Corinth instead. What happened next would become one of the most shocking stories in all of Greek mythology. Medea, betrayed and enraged, turned again to Hecate. She prepared a beautiful robe and a golden coronet as wedding gifts for Jason's new bride. But these were no ordinary gifts. Medea had poisoned them with a substance so terrible, so unnatural, that it could only have come from Hecate's darkest knowledge. When the princess put on the robe and the coronet, they burst into flames that could not be extinguished. The poison seeped into her skin, causing agony beyond description. She died screaming, and her father, the king of Corinth, died with her as he tried desperately to remove the burning garments. But Medea was not finished. To punish Jason completely, to destroy him utterly, she did the unthinkable. She murdered her own children, the sons she had borne to Jason, slaughtering them with a sword while calling upon Hecate to witness her revenge. Then, before Jason could stop her, before the people of Corinth could seize her, she escaped in a chariot drawn by dragons, a gift from her grandfather Helios, leaving Jason alone with his grief and his guilt. This is the story of Medea, priestess of Hecate. And what does it tell us about the goddess she served? It tells us that Hecate grants power without moral judgment. She does not prevent Medea from committing fratricide, from poisoning an innocent woman, from murdering her own children. Hecate provides the knowledge, the magic, the supernatural ability, but she does not guide how that power is used. This is crucial. Unlike other deities who might intervene to prevent particularly heinous acts, Hecate simply empowers. The choice of how to use that power belongs to the practitioner. This made Hecate terrifying to the Greeks and Romans. A goddess who could be called upon to facilitate murder, to enable revenge, to grant the power to transgress the most fundamental human boundaries, the sanctity of family, the protection of guests, the respect for the dead, was a goddess to be feared. But Medea's story did something else. It permanently associated Hecate with harmful magic, with pharmakeia, the use of drugs, poisons, and potions for malevolent purposes. The word pharmacy comes from this same root, but in the ancient world, there was no clear distinction between medicine and poison, between healing and harming. It was all pharmakeia, and it was all under Hecate's domain. Now let us turn to Circe, another famous sorceress associated with Hecate, though the connection is more complex than with Medea. Circe lived on the island of Aea, a place located at the edge of the known world. She was the daughter of Helios and the nymph Perse, making her Medea's aunt. Like Medea, Circe possessed extraordinary magical powers, particularly knowledge of herbs, potions, and transformative magic. When Odysseus and his men landed on her island during their long journey home from Troy, Circe invited them into her palace. She prepared a feast for them, but the food and wine were drugged with one of her potions. As soon as the men ate and drank, Circe struck them with her wand and transformed them into pigs. They retained their human minds, but were trapped in animal bodies, fully aware of their degradation and powerless to reverse it. Odysseus, warned by the god Hermes and protected by a magical herb called moly, was immune to Circe's magic. He confronted her, and they eventually became lovers. Circe reversed the transformation of his men and hosted Odysseus for a year. But the story reveals something important about the nature of transformative magic and its association with Hecate. The ability to transform humans into animals, to change the fundamental nature of a being, was considered one of the most powerful and disturbing forms of magic. It violated the natural order established by the gods. Humans were supposed to be humans. Animals were supposed to be animals. To blur that boundary, to force a metamorphosis, was to tamper with forces that should not be tampered with. While Homer does not explicitly name Hecate in the Odyssey's account of Circe, later sources made the connection clear. Circe's magical knowledge, like Medea's, was said to have come from Hecate. Some versions even claimed that Circe was a priestess of Hecate, or that Hecate herself had taught Circe the arts of transformation and pharmakeia. This association is significant because it expanded the scope of what Hecate's magic could accomplish. It was not just curses and necromancy. It was transformation, the violation of boundaries between species, between rational and bestial, between human and animal. This made Hecate's power even more comprehensive and even more frightening. The stories of Medea and Circe established a template that would be repeated throughout classical literature. The dangerous woman, the foreign woman, the woman with power over men and over nature, was almost always associated with Hecate. These women operated outside the normal social and religious structures. They were not wives and mothers in the conventional sense. They were independent, knowledgeable, and dangerous. This reveals something about ancient Greek and Roman anxieties regarding female power and female sexuality. Women who possessed knowledge, particularly secret or forbidden knowledge, who could control their own destinies and influence the fates of men, were threatening to the patriarchal order. By associating such women with Hecate, and by making Hecate increasingly dark and terrifying, Greek and Roman culture was expressing and reinforcing fears about women who refused to conform to expected roles. But the association between Hecate and witchcraft went beyond mythological stories. It manifested in the real practice of magic in the ancient world. The Greek magical papyri, which I mentioned earlier, demonstrate that real people in the real historical world called upon Hecate for magical purposes. They invoked her to bind their enemies, to compel love, to inflict harm, to protect themselves, to commune with the dead. One particularly revealing category of spells in these papyri are the binding spells or depictions. These were curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with invocations and curses, which were then deposited in graves, in wells, or at crossroads. Hundreds of these tablets have been discovered by archaeologists, and many of them call upon Hecate. A typical binding spell might read something like this, adapted from an actual ancient curse tablet. I call upon you, Hecate, queen of the underworld, accompanied by your terrible hounds and your ghostly attendants. I bind the tongue of my enemy, that they may not speak against me. I bind their hands, that they may not act against me. I bind their mind, that they may think only of defeat. By your power, Hecate, let this curse be accomplished. These were not theoretical or literary exercises. These were real magical practices, used by real people who believed that Hecate would hear their prayers and grant them the power to harm their enemies. The prevalence of such practices and the central role of Hecate within them cemented her reputation as the primary deity of malevolent magic. There was also a particular class of practitioners who were especially associated with Hecate. These were the Goes, a Greek term that can be translated as sorcerer, witch, or howler. The Goes were individuals, often women, who claimed to be able to summon the dead, to inflict curses, to create binding spells, and to perform other forms of malevolent magic. They were feared and often persecuted, but they were also consulted, particularly by those seeking revenge or supernatural aid. The Goes claimed to derive their power directly from Hecate. They performed their rituals at night, at crossroads, in cemeteries, all places sacred to the goddess. They used the symbols associated with Hecate, torches, keys, dogs, and knives. They invoked her with elaborate prayers and sacrifices. In the popular imagination, the gods and Hecate became inseparable. To call upon Hecate was to engage in the same dark practices as the gods. By the Roman period, Hecate's association with witchcraft was complete. Roman writers like Horace, Ovid, and Lucan described her as the ultimate patron of witches. In their works, she is summoned to raise the dead, to poison wells, to strike enemies with madness, to enable every form of harmful magic imaginable. Horace, in his satires, describes a scene where two witches, Canidia and Sagana, perform a necromantic ritual in a cemetery at night. They dig up corpses, tear a black lamb apart with their teeth, pour blood into a trench, and call upon Hecate to send forth the shades of the dead to answer their questions about the future. It is a grotesque and terrifying scene, deliberately crafted to shock and disturb the reader. Lucan, in his epic poem Pharsalia, describes the witch Erichtho, who serves Hecate and practices the most extreme forms of necromancy. Erichtho lives in tombs, wears funeral shrouds, and decorates her lair with body parts stolen from corpses. When she needs to compel a ghost to speak, she reanimates a corpse through Hecate's power, forcing the dead soldier to prophesy about the upcoming civil war. These literary portrayals, while sensationalized, reflected and reinforced popular beliefs about Hecate. She was no longer the goddess honored by Zeus above all others, as Hesiod had described her. She was the queen of witches, the patron of the most transgressive and terrifying magical practices. But we must ask ourselves, why did this transformation occur? What cultural and social forces drove Hecate from protector to threat? Part of the answer lies in the nature of magic itself in the ancient world. Magic was seen as a way to manipulate the gods, to compel divine forces to act according to human will. This was fundamentally different from prayer or sacrifice, which requested divine favor but acknowledged divine supremacy. Magic attempted to force divine action, to bypass the normal relationship between mortals and gods. This was inherently transgressive, and a goddess associated with such practices would naturally be viewed with suspicion and fear. Additionally, as Greek and Roman societies became more urbanized and more structured, the wild, liminal aspects of Hecate became increasingly uncomfortable. She represented the untamed, the uncertain, the places beyond the city walls where law and order did not reach. In a civilization that prided itself on rationality and control, Hecate embodied everything that could not be controlled. There is also a gendered element we cannot ignore. The most famous practitioners of Hecate's magic were women: Medea, Circe, the gods, and the witches described in literature. These women possessed power independent of male authority. They could harm, they could help, they could choose. In patriarchal societies where women's power was supposed to be channeled through their relationships with men, as daughters, wives, and mothers, the independent power represented by Hecate and her devotees was deeply threatening. But perhaps the most significant factor in Hecate's transformation was her increasing association with death and the underworld. And to understand this final stage of her evolution into the Queen of Witches, we must examine her role in one of the most important myths in Greek religion, the abduction of Persephone. The myth of Persephone's abduction and her transformation into Queen of the Underworld is one of the foundational stories of Greek religion. It explained the seasons. It formed the basis of the Eleusinian mysteries, one of the most important religious cults in the ancient world, and it permanently linked Hecate to the realm of the dead. The story begins with Persephone, daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, picking flowers in a meadow with her companions. Hades, god of the underworld, emerged from a chasm in the earth and abducted her, dragging her down to his subterranean kingdom to be his queen. Demeter, grief-stricken and furious, searched everywhere for her daughter. In her anguish, she caused the earth to become barren. Crops failed, famine spread, humanity suffered. But here is the crucial detail. When Demeter began her search, who was the only witness to the abduction? Who saw what happened to Persephone? Hecate. According to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, our oldest source for this myth, Hecate heard Persephone's cries from her cave. She heard the terrified screams as Hades seized the maiden and carried her away. But Hecate did not see who the abductor was. She heard, but she did not witness. When Demeter, frantic with worry, came to Hecate seeking information, the goddess told her what she had heard. Together, Hecate and Demeter went to Helios, the sun god, who sees everything that happens in the light of day. Helios revealed that it was Hades who had taken Persephone, and that Zeus himself had sanctioned the abduction. Eventually, after Zeus intervened and arranged a compromise, Persephone was allowed to return to the upper world for part of each year. But she had eaten pomegranate seeds in the underworld, which bound her to Hades and required her to spend a portion of each year as queen of the dead. And here is where Hecate's role becomes permanent and deeply significant. From that point forward, Hecate became Persephone's constant companion. She attended Persephone both in the upper world and in the underworld. She guided her between the two realms. She served as her torchbearer, lighting the way through the dark passages between life and death. Hecate, who heard the maiden's cries and helped the mother in her search, became the eternal attendant of the goddess, who was both maiden and queen, both daughter of life and bride of death. This role as Persephone's companion cemented Hecate's connection to the underworld. She was no longer merely a goddess who could access the realm of the dead. She resided there. She had a permanent position in Hades' kingdom. She became one of the primary chthonic deities, the gods of the earth and the underworld. But Hecate's role in the underworld was not passive or merely ceremonial. She had power there. She commanded the spirits of the dead. She controlled the terrible demons and monsters that inhabited the darkness beneath the earth. And this power made her one of the most feared figures in Greek religion. The Greeks believed that the dead, particularly those who died violently or prematurely, or who were not given proper burial rites, could become restless spirits. These spirits, called Iori, or the untimely dead, wandered the earth causing harm to the living. They could inflict illness, madness, nightmares, and bad luck. And they were under Hecate's command. Hecate could send these spirits forth to torment the living. Magical papyri contain spells asking Hecate to dispatch the Iori against enemies. Send your terrible spirits, your unavenged dead, your murdered souls, against my enemy. Let them bring nightmares and sleeplessness. Let them drain vitality and inflict wasting sickness. By your power, Hecate, let the dead torment the living. This was the ultimate inversion of Hecate's protective role. The goddess who once guarded households now commanded the very spirits that threatened them. The goddess who protected entrances could send malevolent forces through those same doorways. But there were even more terrifying entities associated with Hecate in the underworld. The Impuci, for instance, were female demons who served Hecate. They had one leg of bronze and one leg of a donkey. They could shapeshift, often appearing as beautiful women to lure men to their doom. The Impuci would seduce their victims, drain their life force, and sometimes consume their flesh. They were vampiric creatures, operating under Hecate's authority. Then there were the Lamii, another class of female demons associated with Hecate. The Lamii were said to prey on children, stealing them in the night and devouring them. Mothers would invoke Hecate's protection against the Lamii, not realizing, or perhaps not acknowledging, that these child-stealing demons served the very goddess they were praying to. The paradox is profound and disturbing. Hecate could protect against the supernatural threats she herself controlled. This made worshipping her not just advisable, but necessary. If Hecate commanded the spirits and demons that threatened humanity, then the only safety lay in keeping Hecate favorable to you. Her worship became a form of protection, money paid to a cosmic power that could harm you as easily as help you. This aspect of Hecate's cult is reflected in the Hecateia, small shrines or statues of the goddess that were placed at doorways and gateways throughout the Greek world. These were not celebratory monuments. They were apotropaic devices meant to ward off the evil that Hecate herself controlled. The very presence of her image was supposed to signal to malevolent spirits and demons that this household or this city was under Hecate's protection and should not be molested. But what if you failed to honor Hecate properly? What if you neglected her shrines, forgot her offerings, or insulted her in some way? Then you would face her wrath, and her wrath was terrible. There are stories of Hecate inflicting madness on those who offended her. The madness sent by Hecate was not the divine frenzy granted by Dionysus, which could be ecstatic and creative. It was dark, terrifying, destructive. Victims would see ghosts that were not there. They would hear voices commanding them to commit terrible acts. They would be tormented by nightmares that bled into their waking hours until they could no longer distinguish reality from hallucination. Hecate was also said to send the night terrors, the incubi and succubi that assaulted people in their sleep. These were not mere bad dreams. They were spiritual attacks, demonic visitations that left victims exhausted, terrified, and sometimes physically harmed. And again, protection against these night terrors required Hecate's favor. The Greeks and Romans also believed that Hecate led what was called the wild hunt, or the nocturnal procession. On certain nights, particularly during the dark of the moon, Hecate was said to ride forth from the underworld, accompanied by a host of ghosts, demons, and restless spirits. This terrible cavalcade would sweep across the countryside. Those unlucky enough to witness it might be struck with madness or death, even hearing the procession pass. The howling of spectral hounds, the wailing of the dead, the clatter of unearthly hooves was considered a dreadful omen. People would lock their doors, cover their windows, and pray that the nocturnal procession would pass them by. They would leave offerings at Crossroads, hoping to appease Hecate and her terrible retinue. The wild hunt was a manifestation of everything terrifying about Hecate: her command of the dead, her association with the night, her power to cross the boundary between the underworld and the mortal realm. This chthonic aspect of Hecate reached its fullest expression in the practice of necromancy, the summoning and questioning of the dead. Necromancy was considered the darkest and most transgressive form of magic. The dead were supposed to remain in the underworld, separated from the living. To call them forth, to compel them to speak, to use them for knowledge or power, was to violate the fundamental order of existence. Yet necromancy was practiced, and Hecate was the primary deity invoked in necromantic rituals. The procedure typically involved going to a cemetery or a crossroads at night, preferably during the dark moon. A trench would be dug, and offerings would be poured into it: blood, wine, honey, milk. The necromancer would then call upon Hecate, asking her to send forth the shade of the deceased person they wished to question. If the ritual was successful, the ghost would appear, drawn by the blood and compelled by Hecate's power. The necromancer could then ask questions, seeking knowledge of the future, the location of hidden treasures, or the secrets of the dead. But this practice was dangerous. Ghosts were not reliable. They might lie. They might refuse to answer. They might even attack the necromancer if the ritual protections were insufficient. And always, there was the risk of Hecate's displeasure if the ritual was performed improperly or for unworthy purposes. The association between Hecate and necromancy completed her transformation into the queen of witches. She was no longer a goddess of the Olympian order, no longer primarily a protector, no longer celebrated in the great public festivals of Greek religion. She had become a chthonic deity, worshipped in secret, at night, in places of death and transition. Her devotees were not the mainstream worshippers, but the practitioners of magic, the ghouls, the necromancers, the individuals operating on the margins of society. This marginalization was both a diminishment and a concentration of power. Hecate lost her position among the great gods, but she gained absolute dominion over a specific sphere, the dark arts, the realm of death, the practice of magic. She became specialized, and in that specialization, she became even more powerful within her domain. By the late Roman period, Hecate was fully established as the primary deity of all forms of magic and witchcraft. She was invoked in love spells, in curses, in protective amulets, in healing rituals, in divination, in necromancy. She was the goddess you called upon when you needed supernatural power, regardless of the purpose. But then everything changed. Christianity rose, spread, and eventually became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. The old gods were suppressed. Their temples were closed or converted into churches. Their worship was first discouraged, then outlawed, then actively persecuted. Many of the ancient deities simply faded away, forgotten as their cults dissolved. But not Hecate. Somehow, incredibly, Hecate survived. She transformed once again, adapting to the new religious landscape in ways that allowed her worship to continue, hidden but persistent, for more than 1,000 years. And that brings us to the final chapter of her dark history, her survival through the Christian era and her resurrection in modern times, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century of the Common Era. The old gods faced a systematic campaign of suppression. Temples were destroyed or repurposed. Sacrifices were forbidden. Pagan priests were persecuted. The vast religious infrastructure that had supported Greco-Roman polytheism for centuries was dismantled. Most of the ancient gods disappeared from active worship within a few generations. Zeus, Hera, Apollo, Athena, the great Olympians who had been worshipped for millennia, became literary figures, characters in old stories, but no longer objects of genuine religious devotion. Their cults ended. Their mysteries were not passed down. They became, in effect, extinct. But Hecate, along with a few other deities associated with magic and the occult, did not disappear. Her worship went underground, became hidden, became secret, but it continued. How did she survive when the great gods did not? The answer lies in the nature of her worship and her associations. Hecate had never been primarily a temple deity with large public festivals and state-sponsored rituals. Her worship had always been somewhat private, somewhat hidden, conducted at night, at crossroads, in secret places. This meant that when public pagan worship became impossible, Hecate's cult could continue with minimal disruption. Additionally, the practices associated with Hecate, magic, herbalism, midwifery, healing, divination, were practical skills that people needed regardless of the official religion. A woman who knew how to assist with difficult childbirth, who understood the properties of medicinal herbs, who could create protective charms, would be valued in her community, even if those skills were theoretically forbidden. These practitioners, often women operating on the margins of society, maintained the knowledge and practices associated with Hecate. They might no longer invoke her name openly. They might disguise their rituals in Christian terminology, calling upon saints instead of goddesses. But the essential practices, the herbalism, the charms, the nocturnal rituals, the crossroads magic, continued. The Christian Church recognized this continuation and responded with the concept of witchcraft as a diabolic crime. Beginning in the late medieval period and reaching its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, European authorities, both Catholic and Protestant, launched a campaign against witchcraft that resulted in the torture and execution of tens of thousands of people, predominantly women. The witch trials were a tragedy, a manifestation of religious paranoia, misogyny, and social anxiety. But they also, perversely, preserved and transmitted the association between women, magic, and Hecate. The confessions extracted under torture, the descriptions of Sabbaths and nocturnal gatherings, the accounts of spells and curses, all echoed the ancient practices of Hecate's worshippers. The witches described in trial records were said to gather at night, often at Crossroads. They were accused of summoning demons and evil spirits. They were said to use herbs and potions to heal or harm. They were believed to have the power to curse their enemies and to see the future. These are all attributes and practices associated with Hecate in the ancient world. Some historians and scholars of witchcraft have argued that there was an actual survival of pre-Christian pagan practices into the medieval and early modern periods. They suggest that the witchcraft described in trial records was not pure fantasy, but represented fragmented memories of ancient goddess worship, particularly the worship of deities like Hecate. This theory, while controversial and not universally accepted, points to a fascinating possibility that Hecate's cult genuinely survived, transmitted secretly from generation to generation for more than 1,000 years. Whether or not an unbroken line of practice can be proven, what is certain is that knowledge of Hecate never entirely disappeared. Medieval and Renaissance scholars who read ancient Greek and Latin literature encountered her in the works of Homer, Hesiod, Ovid, and others. They understood her as the ancient goddess of witchcraft, and that understanding influenced how they thought about contemporary witchcraft and magic. Grimoires, magical textbooks that circulated in manuscript and later in print during the medieval and early modern periods, sometimes included invocations to Hecate alongside Christian prayers and angelic names. This syncretism, this blending of pagan and Christian elements, was characteristic of European magic during this period. Practitioners were willing to call upon any source of power, whether that source was an ancient goddess, a Christian saint, or a demon from medieval demonology. The Enlightenment and the Age of Reason brought a decline in belief in witchcraft and magic among the educated classes. By the 18th and 19th centuries, magic was increasingly seen as superstition, as something that primitive or uneducated people might believe in, but that rational, modern people had outgrown. Hecate, along with other figures of ancient magic, became primarily a subject of scholarly and antiquarian interest rather than active worship. But then, in the early 20th century, something remarkable happened. Interest in paganism, magic, and ancient goddess worship experienced a revival. This revival took several forms and drew on various sources: Romanticism, the occult revival of the 19th century, early feminism, and genuine scholarly research into ancient religions. Out of this complex mixture emerged what we now call modern neo-paganism. And within neo-paganism, Wicca became the most prominent and influential tradition. Wicca was founded in the 1940s and 1950s by Gerald Gardner and others. It claimed to be a revival of ancient pre-Christian witchcraft, though most scholars now agree that it was primarily a modern creation that drew on various sources, including ceremonial magic, folk practices, and romantic ideas about ancient paganism. Regardless of its origins, Wicca placed goddess worship at its center, and Hecate was one of the most important goddesses in the Wiccan pantheon. In Wicca and related neo-pagan traditions, Hecate underwent yet another transformation. The dark, fearsome goddess of ancient magic became a symbol of female empowerment, of hidden knowledge, of the divine feminine. Her association with the Crossroads was reinterpreted as representing choice and personal sovereignty. Her triple nature was linked to the three phases of womanhood: maiden, mother, and crone. Her torches became symbols of illumination and wisdom rather than supernatural terror. This modern reimagining of Hecate is, in many ways, a return to her earliest aspects. Like the ancient Anatolian Hecate, the modern neo-pagan Hecate is a protector, a guide, a goddess who empowers her worshippers. The terrifying queen of witches of classical literature has been softened, made benevolent, made accessible. However, this is not the whole story. Some modern practitioners, particularly those involved in more traditionally oriented forms of witchcraft, or in what is sometimes called traditional witchcraft, as opposed to Wicca, maintain a darker interpretation of Hecate. For these practitioners, Hecate is still the chthonic goddess, still associated with death and the underworld, still a figure of genuine supernatural power who must be approached with respect and caution. These practitioners argue that the Wiccan interpretation of Hecate sanitizes her, removes her edges, makes her safe and comfortable when she should be challenging and transformative. They point to the ancient sources, to the accounts of her association with ghosts and demons, to her role in necromancy and harmful magic. And they argue that a goddess who has been softened and made entirely benevolent is no longer really Hecate. This tension between different interpretations of Hecate reflects a broader debate within modern neo-paganism about the nature of the gods and how to relate to them. Are the ancient gods archetypes, symbols that can be adapted to modern needs and values? Or are they real, independent entities with their own natures and preferences, that must be respected, even when those natures are uncomfortable or challenging. There is no consensus answer to this question, and Hecate, perhaps more than any other deity, embodies this tension. She has been a protector and a threat, a goddess of life and of death, a guide and a terror. Which of these aspects is the real Hecate? Perhaps all of them. Perhaps she contains multitudes, as the ancient sources suggest. In contemporary popular culture, Hecate appears regularly in books, films, television shows, and games. She is usually portrayed as a powerful witch or sorceress, sometimes benevolent, sometimes malevolent, but always commanding respect. These popular culture depictions, while often historically inaccurate, have introduced Hecate to millions of people who might never have encountered her otherwise. The Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan, for instance, features Hecate as the goddess of magic, who can choose to help or hinder the protagonists. The television show Chilling Adventures of Sabrina depicts Hecate as one of the aspects of a dark goddess worshipped by witches. Video games like Hades include Hecate as a character who aids the player. These popular culture representations keep Hecate's name and image alive in the modern consciousness. What is remarkable is that Hecate has endured for more than 3,000 years. From the Bronze Age to the present day, she has been worshipped, feared, invoked, and reimagined. She has survived the fall of countless civilizations, the rise and fall of religions, wars, persecutions, and cultural transformations. Her image and her name have proven extraordinarily resilient. Why? What is it about Hecate that allows her to survive when so many other deities have been forgotten? Part of the answer surely lies in what she represents. Hecate embodies fundamental human concerns: the fear of death, the desire for knowledge, the need for protection, the fascination with the supernatural, the recognition of forces beyond human control. As long as humans face the unknown, as long as we stand at metaphorical crossroads, wondering which path to take, as long as we fear what lurks in the darkness, Hecate will be relevant. She also represents a particular kind of power that operates outside official structures, power that is hidden, personal, and transformative. In patriarchal societies that sought to control and limit female power, Hecate offered an alternative, a goddess who granted power to those who sought it, regardless of their status or gender. This made her attractive to those on the margins, and it ensured that her worship would continue even when officially suppressed. In the 21st century, Hecate is experiencing what might be her greatest revival yet. Thousands of people around the world actively worship her as part of neo-pagan practice. Countless more invoke her name in magic and ritual. Books about Hecate, both scholarly and practical, are published regularly. Online communities dedicated to her worship and study thrive. This modern Hecate is complex, containing elements of all her historical manifestations. She is the protector of the ancient Anatolians. She is the honored goddess of Hesiod. She is the queen of witches of classical literature. She is the chthonic deity of the mysteries. She is the survivor of persecution. She is the symbol of female empowerment. She is all of these and more. Before we reach our conclusion, we must delve deeper into the actual practices of Hecate worship, both ancient and modern. For it is in the rituals, in the lived experience of devotion, that we truly understand how this goddess functioned in the lives of her worshippers, and why her cult proved so enduring. In the ancient world, Hecate's worship followed a distinct calendar rhythm tied to the lunar cycle. The last day of each lunar month, the day of the dark moon when the sky was at its blackest, belonged especially to Hecate. This was when the Deipna Hecatea, the suppers of Hecate, were prepared and left at Crossroads. These were not casual offerings. The preparation of a proper Hecate supper required specific ingredients and careful ritual attention. The meal typically included eggs, which represented the potential for new life and transformation. Honey cakes shaped into rounds or crescents symbolized the moon and sweetness offered to appease the goddess. Fish, particularly red mullet, connected to the underworld and to Hecate's chthonic nature. Garlic and onions, both with protective properties, were included to honor her apotropaic functions. But the most important element was the manner of offering. The worshipper would prepare the food at home, often in silence or while reciting prayers. As night fell and the dark moon rose, they would carry the offerings to the nearest three-way crossroads. There, they would place the food on the ground at the center where the three paths met, speaking invocations to Hecate, asking for her protection, her guidance, or her favor in some specific matter. And then, this is crucial, the worshipper would turn and walk away without looking back. To look back was to risk seeing Hecate herself or the spirits that attended her. It was to show doubt in the ritual, to demonstrate fear, to potentially offend the goddess. The offerings were left for Hecate and for the restless dead who traveled with her. By morning, the food would be gone, consumed either by stray animals, by the desperately poor who scavenged such offerings, or, as believers maintained, by the goddess and her spectral retinue. This monthly ritual created a constant relationship between ordinary people and Hecate. It was not reserved for priests or special initiates. Anyone could make an offering at the crossroads. This accessibility is part of what made Hecate's worship so persistent. She was a goddess of the people, approachable despite her fearsome nature. In addition to the monthly suppers, there were specific festivals dedicated to Hecate. The most important was celebrated on the 13th of August in the Athenian calendar. This festival involved processions to Hecate's temples and shrines, offerings of sacrificial animals, particularly black lambs and dogs, and nighttime rituals that included torch-lit ceremonies. The sacrifice of dogs to Hecate deserves particular attention, as it was unusual in Greek religion. Dogs were Hecate's sacred animals, constantly associated with her in art and literature. Black dogs especially were seen as her companions and messengers. The howling of dogs at night was interpreted as a sign of Hecate's presence, of spirits passing by, of supernatural activity in the area. Why dogs? Several explanations have been proposed. Dogs are liminal animals, domestic yet descended from wild wolves, loyal to humans yet capable of savagery. They guard thresholds, barking to warn of approaching strangers. They can sense things humans cannot, becoming agitated by presences we cannot perceive. Dogs also appear in many cultures as psychopomps, guides of the dead, able to navigate between the world of the living and the realm of death. All of these qualities aligned perfectly with Hecate's nature and functions. The sacrifice of dogs to Hecate was performed at Crossroads, or at the entrances to caves believed to lead to the Underworld. The blood of the dog would be poured into a pit dug in the earth, creating a direct channel to the chthonic realm. The smoke from the burning sacrifice would rise into the night sky, carrying prayers to the goddess. Sometimes, the flesh of the sacrificed dog would be consumed in a ritual meal, creating a communion between the worshippers and the deity. These practices seem alien, perhaps disturbing, to modern sensibilities, but we must understand them in their context. Sacrifice was the primary mode of divine worship in the ancient Mediterranean world. To honor a god was to sacrifice to them. The type of animal, the color, the manner of sacrifice, all of these communicated specific meanings and approached the deity in particular ways. Black animals, including black dogs, black lambs, and black bulls, were reserved for chthonic deities, gods of the earth and underworld. The dark color symbolized the darkness of the subterranean realm, the night when these gods were most active, and the mysterious, hidden nature of their power. To sacrifice a black animal to Hecate was to acknowledge her as a chthonic power, as a goddess of the depths rather than the heights. But Hecate worship also included practices that did not involve animal sacrifice. Purification rituals, for instance, called upon Hecate to cleanse individuals or spaces of spiritual pollution. These rituals often involved fire, reflecting Hecate's role as torchbearer. A person seeking purification might stand at a crossroads, while a priestess of Hecate waved torches around them, using the sacred fire to drive away malevolent influences. Hecate was also invoked in rites of passage, particularly those involving women. Adolescent girls transitioning to womanhood might make offerings to Hecate, asking for her protection and guidance. Women about to marry would pray to Hecate for a successful transition from their father's household to their husband's, crossing the threshold from maiden to wife. And women in childbirth, facing the dangerous threshold between life and death, called upon Hecate more than any other deity. This association with childbirth is often overlooked in discussions of Hecate, but it was vitally important in the ancient world. Maternal and infant mortality rates were staggeringly high by modern standards. Giving birth was genuinely life-threatening. Hecate, as goddess of the threshold, was the deity who could protect both mother and child during this perilous passage. Midwives, who were often also practitioners of folk magic and herbalism, considered themselves under Hecate's patronage. They would invoke her name during difficult labors, call upon her to ease the baby's passage into the world, ask her to prevent hemorrhage or infection, pray to her to protect the newborn's first vulnerable hours of life. This practical, life-saving aspect of Hecate's worship existed alongside her darker associations with death and magic. The magical papyri provide detailed instructions for rituals invoking Hecate for various purposes. These texts, dating from the Greco-Roman period, but preserving practices that were likely much older, reveal the complexity and sophistication of Hecate's cult among magical practitioners. For a ritual to gain Hecate's favor in a legal dispute, the practitioner would be instructed to fast for 3 days, abstaining from meat and wine. On the night of the dark moon, they would go to a crossroads and draw a circle around themselves for protection. They would light 3 torches and place them at the 3 corners of the intersection. Then they would recite a lengthy invocation, calling upon Hecate by her many names and epithets, describing her powers and attributes, and finally making their specific request. The invocations themselves are remarkable documents. They reveal the depth of mythological knowledge expected of practitioners and the elaborate theology that underlay magical practice. Hecate was addressed as key holder of the entire cosmos, mistress of the triple form, she who walks among the tombs, sender of nocturnal visions, commander of the dead, and dozens of other titles, each invoking a different aspect of her multifaceted nature. Some rituals required the creation of specific magical objects. A Hecate wheel or inks, for instance, was a circular disc with symbols and names of power inscribed upon it, attached to a cord. When the cord was pulled, the disc would spin, creating a whirring sound believed to summon Hecate's attention. These wheels were used in love magic, in divination, and in rituals to gain prophetic dreams. Other rituals involved the creation of amulets or talismans inscribed with Hecate's image or her sacred symbols. These protective objects might bear the image of Hecate in her triple form, or they might display her symbols, keys, torches, serpents, daggers, or the crescent moon. Such amulets were worn to ward off evil, to protect against harmful magic, to ensure safe travel, or to grant courage in dangerous situations. The use of Hecate's name in binding spells and curses, as mentioned earlier, followed specific procedures. The practitioner would inscribe a thin sheet of lead with the curse text, calling upon Hecate to bind the victim's tongue, limbs, mind, or other faculties. Sometimes, a small figurine would be created to represent the victim, and this figurine would be pierced with nails while Hecate's name was invoked. The curse tablet and figurine would then be deposited in a grave, a well, or at a crossroads, places where Hecate's power was particularly strong. These practices were not merely theoretical. Archaeological excavations have uncovered hundreds of actual curse tablets many of them invoking Hecate. We have found the remains of ritual pits at Crossroads, containing the bones of dogs and other animals sacrificed to the goddess. We have discovered Hecate wheels, amulets, and statues in contexts that demonstrate they were actively used in religious and magical practice. This material evidence confirms that Hecate worship was widespread and deeply embedded in ancient Mediterranean culture. But what about the more extreme practices, necromancy, and the summoning of the dead? The sources describe these rituals, but did they actually occur? The evidence suggests that they did, though perhaps not as frequently or as dramatically as literary accounts suggest. Necromantic rituals required extensive preparation and carried significant risks. The practitioner needed to identify a recently deceased person who possessed the knowledge they sought. They needed to know where that person was buried, or in some cases, to obtain a piece of the corpse itself, a bone, a lock of hair, a fragment of burial shroud. These physical connections to the dead person were believed to provide a link that could be used to summon their spirit. The ritual itself would be performed at night, in a cemetery, or at a crossroads near a grave. The practitioner would dig a pit and make offerings into it, blood from a sacrificed black animal, wine, honey, and milk. They would then invoke Hecate, asking her to send forth the spirit of the deceased. If successful, the ghost would appear, drawn by the blood offering and compelled by Hecate's authority. The ancient sources emphasize the danger of necromancy. Ghosts were unpredictable and potentially hostile. They might provide false information. They might attempt to possess the necromancer. They might follow the practitioner home, causing hauntings and misfortune. Protective measures were essential. Circles drawn for containment, amulets worn for protection, specific prayers and formulas used to control the summoned spirit. This fear of necromancy, and of those who practiced it, contributed significantly to Hecate's reputation as a dark and dangerous goddess. A deity who could summon the dead, who could compel spirits to return from the underworld, who could grant mortals power over the boundary between life and death, was a goddess who commanded both respect and terror. To fully understand Hecate, we must examine the symbols and objects associated with her. For these visual and material representations communicate essential aspects of her nature and power. The torch is perhaps Hecate's most ubiquitous symbol. In virtually every ancient depiction, she carries torches, usually two, one in each hand. These are not decorative items. They are tools of power and illumination. The torches serve multiple symbolic functions. First, they light the way through darkness. Hecate is a guide, showing the path forward when vision is obscured. This applies both literally, providing light for nighttime travel, and metaphorically, illuminating hidden knowledge and revealing what is concealed. The torch-bearer brings understanding, dispels ignorance, makes the invisible visible. Second, the torches are weapons against supernatural threats. Fire has apotropaic properties in many cultures. Evil spirits, malevolent ghosts, and demons are often said to fear fire and light. Hecate's torches can drive away such entities, protecting those under her care from supernatural harm. Third, the torches connect to Hecate's role in the Persephone myth. She lit the way for Demeter's search, using her torches to pierce the darkness and help the grieving mother find her lost daughter. Subsequently, she used those same torches to guide Persephone between the upper world and the underworld, illuminating the dark passages between realms. Fourth, torches represent transformation. Fire transforms whatever it touches, consuming, purifying, changing one substance into another. Hecate, as a goddess of transitions and thresholds, is fundamentally concerned with transformation. The torches symbolize her power to facilitate change, to convert one state into another. The specific type of torch matters as well. Ancient depictions show Hecate carrying long wooden torches, often made from pine or fir, woods that burn with a bright, aromatic flame. These were not the refined oil lamps of indoor spaces, but the rough, smoky torches of outdoor nighttime travel. They situate Hecate firmly in the wild, marginal spaces, rather than in civilized, domestic settings. Keys are Hecate's second most important symbol. She is Kleidouchos, the key holder, the keeper of keys to all doors. These are not ordinary household keys. They are the keys to cosmic gateways, to the boundaries between worlds, between life and death, between mortal and divine. The symbolism of keys is rich and complex. Keys grant access or deny it. They lock and unlock. They represent authority and control over boundaries. To hold the keys is to determine who may pass and who may not. Hecate, as key holder, controls access to the underworld, to hidden knowledge, to magical power, to spiritual realms. In ancient art, Hecate's keys are often depicted as large, ornate, clearly important objects. They are not tucked away, but prominently displayed, hanging from her belt or held in her hands. This visual emphasis communicates that her role as gatekeeper is central to her identity. The keys also connect to Hecate's association with doorways and thresholds. In ancient Greek homes, keys were often kept at the entrance, near the household shrine. The person who controlled the keys controlled access to the domestic space. By extension, Hecate, as divine key holder, controls access to all spaces, both physical and metaphysical. Dogs, as already discussed, are sacred to Hecate and appear constantly in her iconography. Ancient statues and reliefs show her accompanied by dogs, often 3 of them, reflecting her triple nature. These are not friendly, domesticated pets, but semi-wild creatures, guardians and hunters, loyal yet dangerous. The dog's role as a liminal animal, existing between wild and tame, between useful companion and potential threat, mirrors Hecate's own liminality. Dogs also possess senses beyond human capability. They hear sounds we cannot detect, smell scents imperceptible to us, sense presences that elude human awareness. This heightened perception aligns them with Hecate's knowledge of hidden things. Furthermore, dogs in the ancient world were scavengers, frequenting graves and refuse heaps. This association with death and decay, while unpleasant to modern sensibilities, connected them to Hecate's chthonic aspects. The howling of dogs at night was interpreted as their communication with the dead, their awareness of spirits passing through the darkness. Serpents appear in some depictions of Hecate, coiling around her arms or emerging from the ground at her feet. Snakes are chthonic creatures living in holes in the earth, associated with the underworld in many mythologies. They shed their skins, symbolizing transformation and renewal. They can be deadly, possessing venom that kills, or they can be protective, guarding sacred spaces. All of these qualities resonate with Hecate's nature. The dagger or sword is another of Hecate's attributes. This is not a ceremonial weapon, but a practical blade, a tool for sacrifice, for cutting magical herbs, for inscribing symbols, for protection. The blade represents Hecate's power to sever, to cut away what is unwanted, to divide one thing from another, to make the decisive cuts that transformation requires. The crescent moon appears frequently in Hecate's iconography, particularly in later periods. While Hecate was not originally a lunar goddess, she became increasingly associated with the moon, particularly the dark moon and the waning crescent. The moon's phases, its constant transformation from new to full and back again, reflected the cycles of change over which Hecate presided. The crossroads itself, while a location rather than an object, functions symbolically as one of Hecate's primary attributes. The three-way crossroads, where three paths meet and diverge, represents choice, uncertainty, and potential. Every crossroads is a place of decision, where the traveler must choose which path to take, knowing that each choice leads to a different future. Crossroads are also boundary markers, places where different territories meet, where jurisdictions overlap, where the defined becomes undefined. This liminal quality makes them sacred to Hecate, who rules all boundaries and transitions. The crossroads is simultaneously nowhere and everywhere, belonging to all paths and to none, perfect for a goddess who exists between defined categories. The Hecatean, the shrine or statue of Hecate placed at doorways and crossroads, became one of the most common forms of Hecate representation. These could be simple stone pillars carved with her image, or elaborate three-sided structures with a different face on each side. The Hecatean served both religious and practical functions. Religiously, it marked a space as under Hecate's protection. Practically, it warned potential wrongdoers that this place was watched by the goddess who saw in all directions. Some Hecatea were quite elaborate, featuring not just Hecate's triple form, but also her sacred animals and symbols. A particularly fine example might show Hecate holding torches and keys, with dogs at her feet, serpents coiling around the base, and phases of the moon carved into the background. Such monuments communicated visually the full scope of Hecate's powers and domains. The symbolism extended to colors associated with Hecate. Black was her primary color, representing night, the underworld, the hidden and mysterious. Red appeared as well, the color of blood, of life force, of sacrifice. White sometimes featured, representing the bone purity of death, the pallor of ghosts, the stark illumination of truth revealed. These symbols worked together to create a comprehensive visual language of Hecate worship. A practitioner preparing for ritual might wear black robes, carry a torch and a ritual blade, place offerings at a crossroads near a Hecatean, invoke the goddess while holding a key-shaped amulet, all while being accompanied by the howling of dogs in the distance. Each element reinforced the others, creating a total sensory and symbolic environment that invoked Hecate's presence and power. Understanding these symbols helps us appreciate how Hecate's worshippers experienced her. She was not an abstract theological concept, but a present reality, communicated through specific objects, colors, sounds, and locations. To encounter these symbols was to encounter the goddess herself, or at least to enter a space where her influence was particularly strong. While we have focused primarily on Greek and Roman conceptions of Hecate, her influence spread far beyond the Mediterranean world, and in each new culture, she underwent further adaptations and transformations. In the Eastern Roman Empire, particularly in Asia Minor where her worship originated, Hecate maintained a stronger position than in the Western provinces. The great temple at Lagina in Caria continued to function into the late Roman period, hosting festivals and attracting pilgrims. In this region, Hecate never fully transitioned from her earlier, more benevolent aspects to the purely dark goddess of Western imagination. Archaeological evidence from Lagina shows that Hecate was honored there as Sotira, the savior, a title suggesting protection and deliverance rather than terror. Festival inscriptions describe processions, sacrifices, and ceremonies that emphasized community cohesion and civic pride. This Eastern Hecate, while certainly possessing her chthonic aspects, remained more balanced, more integrated into mainstream religious life. In Egypt, during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, Hecate was syncretized with Egyptian deities, particularly those associated with magic and the afterlife. She was identified with the goddess Hecate, a frog-headed deity associated with childbirth and resurrection. She was also connected to Isis, especially in Isis's role as a powerful magician and mistress of transformative spells. This Egyptian Hecate took on characteristics from her new cultural context. She was incorporated into the complex Egyptian funerary rituals, invoked to protect the deceased during their journey through the underworld. She appeared in magical papyri written in Greek, but used in Egypt, blending Greek magical traditions with Egyptian practices. Amulets from Greco-Roman Egypt sometimes show Hecate in Egyptian style, wearing Egyptian garments and headdresses, demonstrating the visual syncretism that characterized this period. In the Roman western provinces, Gaul, Britain, Germania, Hecate encountered Celtic and Germanic religious traditions. While the evidence is more fragmentary, there are suggestions of identification between Hecate and various local goddesses associated with sovereignty, the land, and the otherworld. The Celtic, Cailleach, an ancient crone goddess associated with winter, storms, and the wild landscape, shares certain characteristics with Hecate's darker aspects. Some scholars have proposed that Celtic practices of leaving offerings at crossroads and at boundary markers represented a continuation or parallel development of Hecate-type worship, though the direct connections are difficult to prove definitively. What is clear is that as Roman culture spread, it carried Hecate's cult with it, and in each new location, local populations interpreted her through their own religious frameworks. In the Byzantine Empire, as Christianity became dominant, Hecate faced direct opposition from church authorities. Christian writers condemned her as a demon, a fallen angel, or a figment of pagan superstition. Church councils specifically forbade offerings at crossroads, attempting to suppress one of Hecate's primary cult practices. Yet even Byzantine Christian texts reveal the persistence of Hecate belief. Medical texts from the Byzantine period discuss Hecate's disease, a condition characterized by nightmares and night terrors, suggesting that people still attributed certain afflictions to the goddess. Folk practices that were clearly derived from Hecate worship continued, though practitioners might now invoke the Virgin Mary or various saints instead of explicitly naming Hecate. This pattern of continuation through adaptation appears throughout the medieval period. Practices associated with Hecate, crossroads rituals, dark moon ceremonies, herbal magic, protection spells, survived by being stripped of explicitly pagan terminology and reframed in Christian or neutral language. A woman preparing a protective charm might no longer invoke Hecate by name, but she might perform the ritual at a crossroads during the dark moon, using the same herbs and gestures that a Hecate worshipper would have used 1,000 years earlier. The Islamic world also encountered Hecate through its absorption of Greek philosophical and magical texts. Arabic translations of Greek medical and magical works preserved descriptions of Hecate and rituals associated with her. Islamic scholars studying Greek philosophy and science encountered her in the writings of ancient authors. While she was not incorporated into Islamic religious practice, knowledge of her survived in scholarly and occult contexts. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, the revival of interest in classical texts brought Hecate back into intellectual discourse. Scholars and magicians reading ancient authors encountered detailed descriptions of Hecate and her cult. Renaissance magical grimoires, drawing on these ancient sources, included invocations to Hecate alongside Christian prayers and Kabbalistic formulas. This created a strange hybrid magical tradition where practitioners might call upon Hecate, the Archangel Michael, and various demons in the same ritual. Seeing no contradiction in mixing pagan goddesses with Christian angels and spirits from medieval demonology. For these practitioners, Hecate was a source of power, and power could be drawn from any tradition that offered it. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries brought another shift in Hecate's cultural position. Romantic poets and artists, fascinated by the mysterious, the Gothic, and the sublime, found Hecate an ideal symbol. She appeared in poetry, in painting, in early Gothic literature as an embodiment of the dark feminine, the dangerous beauty, the terrifying mystery. This romantic Hecate influenced how later generations would perceive her. She became aestheticized, turned into an artistic symbol rather than a living religious reality. This was both a diminishment. She lost her immediate sacred power for many people, and a preservation. Her image and stories were kept alive in cultural memory, even when active worship had largely ceased. We have traveled a long road together tonight, from the ancient temples of Caria to the modern circles of neo-pagan worship. We have seen Hecate in all her aspects, protector and threat, light bearer and darkness dweller, honored goddess and feared witch queen. We have traced her evolution across 3 millennia, watching as she transformed from a benevolent mother goddess into the ultimate symbol of supernatural power and magical transgression. The dark history of Hecate is not a simple story of corruption or degeneration. It is a complex narrative of cultural change, of shifting attitudes toward power, toward the feminine, toward the unknown. Hecate did not become dark because she changed. She became dark because the cultures that worshipped her changed, because their fears and anxieties found expression in the figure of a goddess who commanded forces beyond human control. But perhaps calling this a dark history is itself misleading. Darkness, after all, is not inherently evil. The night is not malevolent. It is simply the absence of light, and in that absence, different things become visible. The stars shine only in darkness. Certain flowers bloom only at night. And certain truths, certain kinds of knowledge, certain forms of power are accessible only when we are willing to venture into the shadows. Hecate, standing at the crossroads with her torches blazing, represents that willingness to face the darkness, to acknowledge the forces we cannot fully understand or control, to embrace the liminal spaces where transformation occurs. She is the goddess of the threshold, and thresholds are by their nature uncomfortable places. They are neither here nor there, neither inside nor outside, neither safe nor dangerous. They are places of potential and of peril, and perhaps that is why Hecate endures. In a world that often tries to eliminate ambiguity, to categorize everything as good or evil, safe or dangerous, acceptable or forbidden, Hecate represents the persistence of the liminal, the inescapable presence of the in-between. She reminds us that not everything can be controlled, that not all power operates through official channels, that the night has its own wisdom that is different from but not inferior to the wisdom of the day. The ancient Greeks feared Hecate but they also honored her. They left offerings at her Crossroads shrines. They invoked her protection. They acknowledged her power. And in doing so, they maintained a relationship with the aspects of existence that cannot be eliminated: death, uncertainty, transformation, the unknown. Modern worshippers of Hecate, whether they emphasize her protective aspects or her chthonic nature, whether they see her as a symbol or as a real entity, are participating in this ancient tradition. They are standing at the crossroads, acknowledging the goddess who has stood there for 3,000 years, asking for her guidance, her protection, her power, or simply her presence. As we conclude this journey into the dark history of Hecate, consider this. Every one of us faces crossroads in our lives, moments of decision where we must choose a path without knowing where it will lead. Every one of us encounters thresholds, transitions from one state of being to another. Every one of us must eventually face the ultimate threshold, the passage from life to death. In those moments, in those places, Hecate stands waiting. Not to harm, not necessarily to help, but to witness, to illuminate with her torches, to hold open the door with her keys. She is the constant presence in the liminal spaces, the goddess who has watched humanity struggle with choice and change and mortality for millennia. And whether you call her name, whether you believe in her existence, whether you honor her or fear her, she remains. At the crossroads, in the darkness, holding her torches high, the eternal queen of witches, the ancient mother goddess, the keeper of keys,